and you come in strong and you come in with, let's say, a warning, a disciplinary notice, a document that's in writing, a performance improvement plan of some kind, and this is the first time you're really having a serious conversation with them, because look at it from the employee's perspective, they're going to see it as your company's taking one step towards firing. Right now, they're documenting everything formally with all sorts of legalese. Your employment is at will, and if you don't improve, it's up to and including separation of employment, right? And all this sort of language that can be very off-putting from the employee's perspective, where a lot of times people will have a really adverse reaction to that. Well, they'll say, you know what, I guess it's time for me to clean up my resume and start looking for another job.
What would be the most, not everything's going to be successful, but what's the best route to take once we identify that we need to have this difficult conversation?
Yeah, it's interesting because, even when you look at the HR profession as a whole, it's very common mantra, right? For us to say documentation, document everything. And I think from a legal perspective, that would be 100% my recommendation to be consistent with that, right? Is you want to document everything. And I think you do. But how you document things and how you present it to the employee makes a big difference. If you're having that first initial conversation with somebody, let's say it's underperforming, and you come in strong and you come in with, let's say, a warning, a disciplinary notice, a document that's in writing, a performance improvement plan of some kind, and this is the first time you're really having a serious conversation with them, that's going to be very off-putting for anyone, right? The fact that they're sitting down with somebody now, whether it's HR or a senior manager, and they're having to go through a document that looks like, because look at it from the employee's perspective, they're going to see it as your company's taking one step towards firing them. Right now, they're documenting everything formally with all sorts of legalese, and the document, all sorts of oftentimes these HR documents will say things like your employment is at will, and if you don't improve, it's up to and including separation of employment, right? And all this sort of language that can be very off-putting from the employee's perspective, where a lot of times people will have a really adverse reaction to that. Well, they'll say, you know what, I guess it's time for me to clean up my resume and start looking for another job. That's usually not what the company wants. They want the employee to improve on whatever the behaviors are. So although that is a recommendation from, let's say, a legal perspective, oftentimes I think the best route to take is to just have that honest, open dialogue with the person and letting them know, like, hey, these are the issues that I'm identifying. And first, you don't want to just come out and cast blame, like, hey, you're doing all these things wrong. Have an open discussion, but say, are we at fault? Is the company not training you enough? Did the training that we provide not really hit the mark? Are we as managers not supporting you enough? Are there certain roadblocks that we're not seeing that are preventing you from behaving in this way? Is it because you're following another employee's, behavior model and they're not maybe the best example to follow? It's something going on at home, right? You got to kind of have this discussion to figure out what is preventing the person from, let's say, meeting whatever the standard is. It's also oftentimes really important for the manager to look internally and say, am I doing something wrong? Am I not being clear with the instructions I'm providing? Right? It kind of looking at all these different layers. And ultimately, you start with that approach, right? Just verbal. Now, when we talk about the documentation piece, I mentioned you can document it in different ways. It doesn't have to be a written warning document that's in writing that they have to sign that has all this scary legalese language. You could potentially just follow up the verbal conversation with an email to the person saying, hey, glad we spoke. Just as a quick recap from my own memory, we talked about X, Y, and Z. I think that we have a good game plan moving forward of how we're going to address these behaviors. Let's touch base in a couple of weeks and kind of see how things are going, right? And you're kind of still doing both things. You're having that human interaction with someone where you're kind of having these discussions, but at the same time, you're also covering your bases by documenting it in a less scary way with this kind of a quick follow-up email recap, instead of starting off with like the formal performance improvement plan. I think that's something that you can eventually escalate to, right? A lot of times you'll hear about the whole concept of following a progressive discipline model, which I think is the right step to take. Where I think a lot of managers oftentimes, and I think most managers do start off with a conversation. I think where they usually tend to make a mistake is that then they usually forget to escalate at some point and start documenting it on a more formal fashion with some kind of performance improvement template or some kind of plan. And that's usually where I tend to see that's more common than the opposite end of it. But that would be my recommendation overall to kind of make the experience as smooth as possible for both sides.
Thank you, Ricardo. And I think one of the things key here is really the human aspect, having those conversations. Often someone leaves and we promote from within and put these folks into a position of management. And this documentation seems to be one of the biggest challenges. So we sometimes document and then time passes, things are going well, the same problem occurs again. And then there's a gap and lapse. And what you just said made perfect sense. And we're talking also about human resources play an important role in a company. And what role should they play in shaping a legal and ethical framework and to set this business up for success?
I think they have to be a central figure in that entire process. HR is already intertwined with the whole compliance and legal framework because we have to ensure that we're meeting, the requirements for federal law. That's a US-based company, federal law, right? And then any specific state requirements, and even for certain cities in the US, maybe even local city jurisdiction requirements. So you already have a lot of that foundation to address those legal concerns, legal issues. But I think you can also take it a step further to touch on the ethics component, especially nowadays where now it's even getting a little bit more complicated because you're introducing AI into the equation, and you want to make sure that whenever you're making decisions, let's say you're using AI as part of the decision-making process, you want to make sure that you have a human in the loop of that decision-making process to make sure that you're addressing any ethical issues, any ethical concerns that might apply for whatever the topic is that we're looking at. But HR should certainly be a central figure in that whole equation because, oftentimes you need somebody who is focused on the people side, right? The workforce. And oftentimes you don't have a representative of the workforce in some of those senior leader discussions, right? Because you may have somebody like a CFO who's focused on the financial, right? You may have on the CEO who's focused on the mission. You may have a COO who's focused on operations. You need somebody that's a representative of, let's say, the people, the employees. And that's usually HR or whomever is in charge of HR for that company, because and not to say that those other individuals can't give voice to those things, but usually it's HR who is most in tune with the employee experience. And therefore, they're usually the ones that should be a central figure in that whole discussion.
So what are most surprising compliance oversights, and what can companies, especially those who are spread out, maybe there are global companies and now we have challenges with compliance?
It's tricky, especially in the US. You see a lot of issues related to compliance, especially for smaller businesses. Usually the areas that I identify, especially when we do HR evaluations, tend to be around wage and hour violations. Someone's not being paid correctly on some level. Oftentimes it's related to FLSA classification mistakes where somebody is, let's say, classified as an exempt salaried employee and they really should be a non-exempt hourly employee. But because they're classified as exempt, they're now eligible for overtime, which then could be a potential source for litigation in the future, some kind of claim. So wage and hour are very common issues. Accommodation requests are often poorly mishandled by small businesses. And when I say accommodation requests, that could be an accommodation based off of religious grounds or religious accommodation. It could be a leave of absence type request for accommodation, a disability accommodation, a pregnancy accommodation. Those are oftentimes mishandled by small businesses because oftentimes they don't have the right foundation. They don't have the right framework of how to handle these potentially tricky conversations with employees. So usually somebody drops the ball and it's not handled correctly because they don't have an SOP, a standard operating procedure for how to handle these issues. So those are very common mistakes. Leaves of absences are always a common one. And then as you can imagine, if you expand your workforce beyond a certain region, right, it gets even more increasingly complex, right? You start adding in multiple states. Now you're talking not just federal requirements, but now you have to be in tune with whatever the state requirements are. Certain states are constantly adding new employment laws. Like if you're in Illinois, Colorado, Washington, California, New York, New Jersey, they're constantly adding in new requirements. So it's even more important to be in tune of how these things kind of all interconnect. And then you start talking about global, which was part of your question, then it's even more chaotic, right? Because everybody does their own thing. So you really have to learn to rely on a lot of other experts, outside experts that may be in tune with that specific market, that specific country, state, whatever it may be, to really make sure that you are kind of crossing all your T's and dotting all your I's, especially the more the business grows. Of course, it just adds more and more layers of complexity along the way.
Looking at national companies, each state has its own unique laws, wage changes, and variety of things that you just spoke about. What can a company do? What help could they require or request to meet these standards? And one of the other questions that I really comes up to me is, how do you find out when the laws are changing and share that information to every department?
So two things. One, when it comes to staying up to date, one thing that I learned early on in my career when I first started working in HR that served me really well and still does to this day is I subscribed to all sorts of legal blogs from law firms that specialize in employment law. And that's a key distinction because oftentimes people will have this perception of, well, I can go and talk to any lawyer. And that's not the case. You want to find a lawyer that specializes in employment law, right? Just like if you had a criminal matter, you wouldn't go talk to a divorce attorney. You'd go talk to a criminal lawyer. It's the same thing here. You want to talk to an attorney that specializes in employment law. And with that being said, I found it incredibly helpful just to find most of the larger employment law firms have all sorts of legal blogs that you can follow, and they'll talk legalese to each other all the time, right? It's intended for a lawyer audience, but as an HR professional or as a business owner, it's incredibly valuable because they start talking about changes all the time, right? Oh, this new legislation is being voted on in the state Senate. Oh, this governor just signed this into law. Oh, this law is going to go into effect such and such time. Oh, this court just struck down this part of this law, right? So as you're learning about all these different things, it really helps you to stay in tune with what's going on when it comes to employment law issues, whether it's federal or state specific. And it's also interesting because then you start seeing all the different times that, of course, attorneys will disagree with one another, right? So it's always interesting to find out, who's saying what and whatnot, but that's incredibly valuable towards understanding all the different changes as things come on.